President Xi Jinping of China will not be attending the India-hosted G20 Summit in Delhi that begins in just a few days from now at the end of this week. But that's not the only thing, because China has made it policy, state policy, to be as obstructionist as possible to everything that India stands for or proposes on international forums all around the world. Watch this report by India Today's Foreign Affairs editor, Geeta Mohan.
As India gears up to host the G20 Leaders Summit, China sees red over India cementing its position as a growing global superpower. After declining Prime Minister Narendra Modi's invitation to attend the summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping is pushing differences with India to a broader platform. Beijing is opposing several of India's G20 proposals, from high-profile issues like the Ukraine crisis and climate change to matters such as mission life, women-led development and MSMEs.
When you host, you should be able to bring some priorities, whether it's the Prime Minister's Life Initiative that looks at the way our behavior affects the environment, or the focus you've had on a digital public infrastructure, and looking at the ways you can empower people even at the lowest economic levels by new technology.
China has even voiced disagreement with India's chosen slogan for its G20 presidency, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This has posed a significant challenge in reaching a consensus within the G20, despite India's efforts to iron out differences. Following India's instrumental role in achieving a consensus at last year's Bali G20 Summit, experts suggest that China's current stance could be a calculated move to prevent India from hosting a successful G20 summit. Despite China's opposition, the US has expressed confidence that India will manage to find a middle ground.
We are hopeful that that will be the formula that will be successful. It's on the chair's responsibility to bring that together, but I have a high level of confidence that India's relationships with multiple nations can bring that together, and I hope that other countries will defer to India's leadership.
This discord between India and China has not just affected bilateral relations, but is stalling progress on pressing global challenges, from climate change to economic stability. With Geeta Mohan in Delhi, Bureau Report, India Today.
Geeta Mohan and Gaurav Sawant both with me on this. They'll be fronting our coverage of the G20 Summit when it comes up at the end of this week. Geeta, to that report that you've just, we've just put out to our viewers on China's pattern of obstructionist practices for practically everything that India is, putting on the international table right now. How is it being received by the Indian diplomatic system? How is it being navigated?
Well, it is very difficult. It is one of the biggest challenges for India, Shiv. The fact that there have been 19 ministerials, 19 outcome documents without consensus so far. And now the final Sherpa meeting is taking place even as we speak in Haryana. So the biggest challenge certainly for India will be to get a consensus document. There are two areas where there is a problem. One is the Russia-Ukraine war, which Russia and China have opposed. But that is a matter of geopolitical issues where China says, let's not bring geopolitical issues in. Russia, of course, is opposed to the idea because Russia is involved. But it's the other areas that we just reported on that certainly shows China's unwillingness and intent to ensure that this certainly is not a win for India. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, millets, women-led development, these are great ideas. These are just proposals by the Indian side, and China every step of the way, including the climate talks that took place where maybe China was more opposed to the Western idea of zero carbon emission, but has put obstacles every step of the way for India. So the biggest challenge will be a consensus document.
Okay, a consensus document is a challenge. Gaurav, how is the Indian government pushing back on this? Because India has the responsibility now of hosting the G20. It's a reality that Xi Jinping will not be attending. What's the view within the government about how to push back?
So Shiv, this is about G20 and this is about India being the voice of the global south or the developing world. This isn't about Xi Jinping. This isn't about, it's like, remember in our childhood, if some boy wasn't getting it his way, he would say, "Main nahi khel raha, I'm not playing," and he would leave the field. That's exactly what Xi Jinping is doing right now. He can't have it his way, so he says, "I won't play." And India knows that, the world knows that. And India's emergence is something that China cannot stall. China may try, but China will not succeed. And we've seen this. We've seen this post-COVID. We've seen that the world is very wary of a bully like China. The world is very wary. And that is why global supply chains increasingly are trying to shift out of China, or at least going on China +1. Initially, India is one of those grounds. Asia, other ASEAN countries, again, emerging as that ground that everyone wants. Nobody wants to deal with the bully. India is seen as a friend. It is India that wants the African Union to be a part of the G20. India wants to take Africa along. India wants to take developing countries along, and we've seen that in vaccine Maitri. China, on the other hand, wants to bully countries into submission, and there is an intense pushback from all countries, and increasingly democracies of the world are uniting, and an expansionist country like China, and Xi Jinping realizes that there will be a pushback of democracies, and that is why he's choosing to skip this, and it shows him in very poor light.
Very, very poor light, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next minute. Thanks very much, Gaurav and Geeta, for putting that into context for us. Chinese President Xi Jinping's decision to skip the G20 summit in Delhi is perhaps the biggest compliment to India, viewer, in my personal opinion, and perhaps the biggest ever affirmation of India's rise. Now, this is not an emotional or patriotic or chest-thumping statement. So let me explain why I'm saying it with some facts and figures. For starters, the G20 summit is something that boosts India's stature, not exactly President Xi's cup of tea. But obviously, it's more complicated than just that. China has actually begun to disagree and diverge, as you saw, with India on practically everything under the sun on international forums, from geopolitics to climate change to women's empowerment issues to small and medium enterprises. The list of things that China specifically disagrees with or obstructs India on is growing ever longer with each passing week, literally. Think about that for just a moment. Would China spend so much of its diplomatic energy if its view of India hasn't dramatically changed in the last decade or more? China and India enjoy a major trade relationship and are economic partners across industries. But China's clear annoyance and irritation with a more organized and investable India is becoming difficult for Beijing to hide any longer. The post-COVID world affords a new look at the international order, and India's insistence on a new hierarchy and rules of engagement upset the world order of the old times, and China is feeling the heat. China's support of the Ukraine war, as opposed to India's balanced, pragmatic and independent approach, has thrown into deep contrast the hard questions China would face if its president attended, for instance, a G20 summit in Delhi. Comparing India and China is a tricky business. Let's be very clear, let's be factual. India has many miles to go before it becomes the kind of manufacturing economic powerhouse that China currently is. But the seeds have been sown for an India that will in time be on par and then bigger than China. China's opposition to Indian proposals is understandable because when it comes to high-tech manufacturing, aerospace or automobiles, China's loss is slowly and incrementally becoming India's gain. There are so many examples of it. The World Economic Forum's 2023 report put out in May this year prophesies that the shift in global supply chains from an increasingly volatile and unreliable China that's embroiled with Taiwan, the Ukraine war, will directly move to India and fuel the economic growth story here in India. Diplomacy and strategic relations are complex and layered. There's no real room for emotion in them. All that matters is power and self-interest. But China, in my view, has been letting its emotions and insecurity show. Despite the long road that India must travel to match China on an entire plethora of economic and other indices, Beijing is clearly on guard. And it is this that is perhaps the most historic subliminal affirmation of China's vulnerability. So entrenched is this new China's view of India that it is unable to resist even opposing India's chosen slogan for the G20 presidency, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or the world is one family. What possible problem could China have with a slogan like that? That the Indian military has stood firm in eastern Ladakh, matched the Chinese move for move on that frontier, and even pushed the standoff into their claimed territory, has seasoned this era of Beijing's awakening to a new India. And therefore, President Xi Jinping's decision to skip the G20 in Delhi later this week is therefore only the icing on a cake of strategic annoyance that has been in the oven for a while now. India and China are neighbors. They must compete, but they must also find a way to de-escalate from the military standoff in eastern Ladakh immediately. There's much to be achieved for the global south. China has much to gain from peace with India, much more to gain than without. Thank you for listening.